So if I could just ask two follow-up questions, so maybe you can unpack some of those things. I mean, you mentioned, of course, I think it's an important role to provide information on rules of origin for small firms. But you also mentioned providing training. But I mean, what kind of training and is that, and how is the ministry best placed to do that? And secondly, does the Ministry of Trade and Industry have a sort of vision about how it could use AFTA to create regional value chains that do or do not also feed into export markets? I mean, you mentioned auto, and that's an interesting case. I wasn't aware that there were 7 companies in Ghana. I have to say that that was news to me. But is that part of a broader strategy, or do you? I think this is something we'll also talk about in the last, panel. But is FDI attraction strategic? Are you looking to attract a specific kind of FDI and players to come in, or is it sort of just, a broad policy to attract anyone?
Yeah, so it's targeted. We have an industrial agenda. So automobile falls under strategic anchor industry. So we have about 10 of them. That includes auto. There is petrochemical. There is industrial starch. There is salt. There is textiles and garments. So it's sort of it's targeted, but these 10 of them. And so what the ministry is doing is that attracting investments into these sectors. Iron and steel is also part. And then with the training, it is not the ministry that provides the training directly. It is done through the coordination office. So the coordination office would look for expertise to train the exporters to export into the regional markets. So it's not the Ministry of Trade doing it directly. It is through the coordination office because they coordinate the activities on the platform.
So I don't want to put you on the spot, but since you're one of the only government bureaucrats here, I'm gonna push you in the name of all. So I couldn't help it because you said petrochemicals was on the 10, and obviously that's not a green industry. So how is I mean, is green industrialization even on the agenda in Ghana? Because yeah, you mentioned petrochemical, you mentioned iron and steel, and we'll talk in a minute with Professor Black, but also tomorrow about green hydrogen. So of course, with iron and steel, it's about greening the production process itself. But to me, the list, you didn't say all 10 of them, but the list you gave is pretty standard, like pre-green industrialization agenda. So I don't see green industrialization really featuring there at all. How would you respond to that?
Oh, yes, you're right. In fact, when I was sitting down, I was thinking, as I said, we are developing the policy on industrial parks and special economic zones. So I was thinking of how to inform the chief director of incorporating green industrialization into that policy, because attracting investors into that space is very important. Like petrochemical is free green, like you said. But we are looking at the whole gamut, sort of creating jobs. The mind of government is to create jobs. So how do you create jobs? Okay, these industries, let's focus on them. But our attention really as a ministry has not gone, I would say, green. That's okay, we are going green. But it's an area we have to look at, that, okay, in developing this policy, like I said, the industrial parks and special economic zones policy, how do we integrate that? Because if you remember the earlier speaker from Energy Commission, she was saying that there were incentives for the automobiles, but it wasn't specifically for EVs. It was general. It was for all automobiles. So the ministry's focus is not really, okay, green, but we can align. We can sort of infuse that into that policy.
Pick up on what we were talking about earlier in the first panel. the green itself is in the industries, right? So it's supporting EVs instead of ICE. It's about supporting biofabrication instead of petrochemical, right? So, I mean, I think it's a common theme that I think it's representative of other governments that the focus is on employment. But what I think we would, those of us who are promoting the green industrialization agenda are trying to say, and maybe you can relay this back, is that you can do, that the focus should be on getting into new technologies, and that in a way will also create employment. But why just create employment in old tech that won't generate much income and will leave you left behind when you could generate employment and go into new tech? So it's just something to think about, and we hope that also the workshop inspires to think about how industrial policies can also be green. And on that note, I will turn to Professor Black, so we're now online, who is going to talk about regional opportunities in e-mobility and green hydrogen a little bit in advance, because we're actually getting to green hydrogen tomorrow, but talk about it anyway. So I think that was just, it was a general question that we'll start with. Anthony, what do you see as regional opportunities, I guess, as opposed to just looking at individual African countries?
Right, thanks. Well, I'm going to, so what I thought I would do is sort of contrast two regional opportunities, very different sectors. And I know we've spoken about electromobility earlier today, and tomorrow there's a section on green hydrogen. So I'm going to talk about these two sectors, which are obviously very different, and two different regions, West Africa for electric two-wheelers, and Southern Africa really for green hydrogen. So, I mean, just a few points about, these are such different sectors, and they've got very different, require different industrial policies. I think they've got different developmental implications. They're also receiving very different kinds of, let's call it publicity or hype. I mean, certainly in South Africa, green hydrogen is really very high on the kind of government and business agenda. And I would argue, actually, in my little piece here, I'm going to actually argue that it's perhaps the question of electric two-wheelers. It could be West Africa, it could be East Africa, it could be North Africa, not so much in Southern Africa, except perhaps Mozambique, Angola. But as a regional development project, it should be getting much more of a profile, actually, and possibly green hydrogen is being overhyped. So let me just continue with that. Let me just say a little bit about electric two-wheelers. Well, this is the area the only sector where electromobility has actually made a full transition, and that's in China, where you've got up to 250 million electric motorcycles on the roads, right? So it's a massive industry. It's in the cities. It's the main form of two-wheel mobility. Now, this is happening quite rapidly in Southeast Asia, also in India. For example, in India, 4% last year, 4% of the motorcycles sold were, and that amounts to 640,000, because there were 16 million motorcycles sold last year in India. 4% of those were electric, and that percentage is rising very rapidly. Last year, 40% of three-wheelers in India were electric. So this revolution is happening very rapidly in the two-wheel sector. In Africa, it's not really happening. We heard a few examples, but I think they're pretty small in relation to the total number of motorcycles on the market or being sold. And Africa is a huge importer of motorcycles. And also, there's a lot of talk about the automotive sector in India, and I do think that this two-wheeler sector is a massive developmental opportunity. So the case for going electric, low-cost mobility, but also reducing urban air pollution, which in some West African cities is very, very serious problem. Competitive advantage, well, yes, we know manufacturing capabilities are weak, and you're competing with low-cost producers like India and China. But motorcycles does offer entry point into the automotive sector, as was the case in countries like Thailand, India itself, and places like Vietnam as well. The barriers to entry in electric two-wheelers are quite low. Also, we don't have the problem of in the motorcycle market of used imports. That's a huge problem bedeviling the automotive, the development of the automotive sector. And you could add to that the lack of sort of brown assets in this industry. It's not like there are a whole lot of engine factories and so on, which would have to be phased out, and that would be costly and so on. So on the policy side, well, it's a question, and we can talk about that later. It's a question of, I mean, regional integration is obviously incredibly important. It's a question of attracting in big multinationals, I think, and requiring certain amounts of local content. And certainly you'd require some protection for this as well. But let me just then say a few words about green hydrogen. Okay, so this is a sort of rapidly growing industry, some 200 projects worldwide with $70 billion just of government funding, not private sector funding. In South Africa and Namibia, there's a lot happening. We've got recently published green hydrogen commercialization strategy in South Africa, and the Just Economic Transition Partnership, which is funding from the US and European Union and the UK, has put a lot of emphasis on green hydrogen. So the big projects on the table, the Hyphen project in Namibia is absolutely gigantic in relation to the size of the economy. Buchabai, Saldanha, Kucha, there's a whole lot of schemes which are in various stages of planning and implementation. In the commercialization strategy put forward by the DTIC in South Africa, very sort of ambitious employment figures. I mean, I saw one figure in the value chain of 650,000 jobs in the sector. I mean, that seems highly exaggerated to me. And also that South Africa could produce 8 to 10% of the global market share for green ammonia and methanol for shipping. So anyway, these are, what I'm saying is that they're very big plans on the table. And I think what's perhaps important for us is what are the industrial policy requirements or implications? Of course, some of this will be export focused, but there's also the domestic market, which not in the Namibian case, but in the South African case is quite large because of the potential use in, well, you can use it in mining in Namibia, but in South Africa, you've also got a lot of heavy metal processing, steel, aluminium, etc., which could potentially use green hydrogen. So the advantages, well, solar and wind resources in South Africa, you've got some technology competence, Fischer-Tropsch, the expertise with platinum group metals and so on. But there are also a lot of disadvantages. Infrastructure, the investment climate in South Africa, the high cost of capital, the distance to markets, and also technology risks. I mean, to what extent will green hydrogen actually achieve what some people say it should achieve? So finally, just to conclude on some of the industrial policy issues, I think the key issue for industrial policy in green hydrogen, which differentiates it from other more traditional sectors, you could say, is that it's very demanding in terms of coordination that's required. And I'm thinking of, you've got so many moving parts. You've got the national state, you've got local government, you've got the private sector, you've got multinational investors, you've got multilateral agencies, and very massive infrastructure requirements. So there's a lot to do in terms of coordination. Yes, and so this kind of institutional complexity means that you've really got to pay attention to can you develop pockets of efficiency to actually carry out these big mega projects. Their first mover advantages, there's also the question of local content, which I don't have time to get into. But then I think a very important issue, which concerns me a lot, is the level and direction of support. Is this going to be another sort of bias to subsidize capital-intensive mega projects, as we have a long history, both pre-apartheid and post-apartheid in South Africa, and to some extent in Namibia as well, of sort of mega projects which don't generate much direct employment and also get heavily subsidized. For example, in the commercialization strategy, there's talk of a requirement of $13 billion in capital expenditure, and that would in turn require $3.25 billion in grants. And there's a lot of talk about subsidies, pricing, benefits. And for example, in comparing South Africa to Morocco, and I think the same would apply to Namibia possibly, and I'm quoting here, it says, would make up the cost differential through government support programs. Now, that's because Morocco can pipe green hydrogen, apparently pipe green hydrogen into the European market, and obviously Southern Africa has a bit of a problem in terms of distance. So I'll end off there, and thanks very much.
I have questions, but I'm aware that Jody has to leave us. So Jody, if you still have a few minutes, we'd still like to get a few words from you. Sorry, we're on Ghana time. I was going in the opposite direction, come back to all of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area interventions together. That's why I skipped you. But yeah, so you were going to talk about domesticating AFTA protocols. So I'll just ask you an open-ended question, and then you can talk about what you want to emphasize. But what policies and initiatives are needed at the national levels for the domestication of AFTA protocols for interlinked or regional industrial development, and in particular, development?
Thank you so much. I trust that you're still on the line and that everyone can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Fantastic. Okay, that's fantastic. I think the first point to emphasize is that, business has got to be involved as well. So, of course, when we think about the domestication, all of the legal complexities come to mind, and the fact that you've got very different legal systems across the continent, huge diversity there also in terms of capabilities. But it's not just about that legal process. There's got to be greater business engagement and sensitization. So the implications of the protocols have got to be effectively communicated to business, and it's just this process of kind of spreading the knowledge so that we're not just confined to capital cities either, because we've got to the protocols and the implications for boosting intra-African trade, intra-African value chains, we've got to filter down to different levels, and the level of MSMEs and so on. So I think it's that kind of knowledge spreading activity, and within this process of domestication, I think inevitably there will be some of that, but it's got to be really, really kind of reinforced with more systematic business engagement. So I do think kind of beginning, kind of building on, not beginning, but kind of building on initiatives like the Guided Train Initiative, and building on sector-specific value chain analyses. I think this helps to kind of bring more alive the issues around, domestication and why these protocols matter, why they matter for business. So it's about, trying to ensure that business is engaged, and that these knock-on effects that will come from the process, are eventually realized. So I think it's really critical that there needs to be kind of more systematic engagement around intra-regional value chains, and perhaps even the consideration of continent-wide policy as well, that could help to more effectively kind of join up and align business and build up some more momentum there. What we've learned from other regions of the world, and I don't want to just focus on the EU, But what we've learned from other regions. So if we look at the ASEAN, for example, they, like Africa, like the continent, they have the countries within ASEAN also have very different legal systems, but they, in terms of their integration process, they really began, with this kind of coordination, advocacy, kind of building cooperation frameworks and more of a kind of sectoral approach. I think that that process could be really, really helpful, so that we're not just getting bogged down in the legal text and legalities, but we're thinking about the broader societal benefits, that will be reaped in the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think I'm going to turn to Francis now on that. And Anthony, I'm going to come back to you because I have questions. But Francis, from the AFTA Secretariat, can you, and I'm going to deviate a bit from the preordained text, how green is the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement protocols? And does that even really matter? Because as I was saying, it's the industries that are green. So if we're promoting trade and the building of regional industries, we can use AFTA to promote green industries. It doesn't matter if there's anything, or my question to you is, it doesn't matter if there's nothing green in it? That's the question that I think George had written, but do we even have to see the word green if it's about promoting industries and those who are implementing it want to promote green industries? There's nothing stopping us. So that was a couple of questions packed into one about this idea of, is AFTA green or not? So what are your thoughts on that?
Right. Thank you so much, Professor Lindsay. First of all, if you allow me, I would like to thank ASET and yourself for organizing this event. It is a very important event, and also for inviting us. I would also like to appreciate the presenters. I think you put together a very good team. That's why I actually have been trying to listen in since morning. I set aside